Are we repackaging ourselves to meet the expectations of others, or are we repackaging ourselves to align with our authentic selves? Going from belonging closer to authenticity brings up a lot of fear. Welcome to Secret Garden. It's episode 1, intro episode, and it's the beginning of a new year. This whole new year, new me thing is in full swing, and I'm taking that a step further, putting my own spin on it, and putting out a new podcast. So here we are. Now, if you're watching on video, you're probably thinking, Allie, why aren't you surrounded by plants and trees? This is Secret Garden. Just you wait. Just you wait. Now, I fully recognize that I'm sort of blending into my background right now. I don't really know what to do with that. I'm still trying to figure it out, but here we are. Now, what I love most about the new year is that it gives us an opportunity to package ourselves differently. And that can be, from a very small thing, like for example, I'm really loving ring stacks right now. I want to figure out how to wear a whole collection of rings on my fingers. So the other night I self-measured the ring size of every single finger and I'm buying rings. It could also be on a more grand scale of oh my God, I want to overhaul my entire life. Nothing feels like it fits me anymore. I've totally been on that end of the spectrum. So I get it. We're here. And as we think about packaging ourselves differently, there's a really important question that I think we have to ask ourselves, which is, are we repackaging ourselves to meet the expectations of others, or are we repackaging ourselves to align with our authentic selves? And when I think about this, I think about a spectrum of belonging on one end, authenticity on the other. And, the closer we get to authenticity, the more successful we'll be, the more satisfied we'll be, the more peaceful we'll be. So as we try and make sense of, okay, how do we move from the belonging end of the spectrum to the authenticity end of the spectrum, I think it's sometimes helpful to look to examples out in the world of people who have done this successfully. So let me give you an example. So I used to work at an advertising agency, and one year at the holiday party, the CEO swung from the roof of the theater in a harness over the crowd of the entire Chicago employee population. That was the backup performance. Plan A was supposed to be that Chance the Rapper would perform. The next year, Plan A was to have Shawn Mendes perform, but we ended up with a backup plan again. Now, this time the CEO firmly kept her feet on the ground, which thank God, but instead there was a young gal who walked out onto the stage. She had super long hair, blonde, straight hair, and she was wearing this sweatshirt dress with patent leather thigh-high boots. And so she gets on stage, she starts singing her first song, and I don't think anyone really introduced her until after that first song. So once the first song was over, the CEO comes out on stage. She introduces this person, and this person's name was, drumroll please, Sabrina Carpenter. And I distinctly remember whispering to my friend next to me, she looks like Ariana Grande. And if you can't see the screen right now, I'm showing a side-by-side pic of Sabrina Carpenter at the holiday party next to Ariana Grande in her sweatshirt dress and thigh-high boots era. So this was December 2018. So that would have been a couple years after Sabrina completed her time on Disney Channel. And fast forward to now, Sabrina's a global superstar. And when I think about this in the context of belonging versus authenticity, when I look at these photos, all I see is like, okay, Sabrina Carpenter was definitely showing up more from a place of belonging. I mean, she's literally giving Ariana Grande vibes. Like, she's wearing Ariana Grande's outfit. And just to show a comparison of what Sabrina looks like now, she clearly has her own unique look. Like, there's only one Sabrina Carpenter. And gosh, from then to now, she's gone from one end of the spectrum of belonging to the other end of authenticity, and look where she is. Like, I think that's so inspiring. To me, just based on different interviews I've heard of Disney child stars, it feels like being a Disney child star is literally the furthest you can go on the spectrum of just like pure belonging, because all you're doing is trying to meet the expectations of what other people think your identity should be. And there's adults in positions of power who are telling you exactly what you should be, do, say. And I imagine that the pressure in that type of environment is so great that it's easy to disconnect from your authenticity. It's like you just over time forget about who you really are or lose touch with that. And as a kid, I can only imagine it just feels so much more extreme. And when you get out of that type of environment, it's not just a flip of the switch and you're like, oh, back to my authentic self. Like, I can be as playful as I want to be. I can do all the things that like I was born to love. It's a journey to get back to that place of like knowing who you are and what you want to be and what you want to do and say. And so I've been thinking about that a lot, because the steps that Sabrina would have had to take to go from, the belonging end of that spectrum of being a part of Disney Channel to where she is now. I think the reason why she's so successful now is because she's consistently peeled back the layers of what didn't feel like her. And the more she's done that and the closer she's gotten to her authentic self, that's really what has caused her to skyrocket and be so successful and be this global superstar that we know her as. And, I recently watched an interview that Sabrina Carpenter did with Zane Lowe, and they were kind of talking about this, where she was saying like over the course of her career, she's constantly been repackaging herself to, I would imagine, I don't know that she said this verbatim, but like I would imagine in that repackaging process, she's constantly tweaking things to become more like herself, what feels more like her. And in that interview, they were also talking about how like throughout all of her musical career, there's always been those authentic elements that have been consistent throughout. Like, for example, her humor has always been there, but perhaps in the beginning it was just a little bit more subtle, and now it's more at the forefront. And the humor is what allows her to connect to so many more audiences and to bring people into her world in a way that she wasn't able to do in the beginning. And so I think this concept is so powerful of belonging versus authenticity. And Sabrina Carpenter is a great example of how the closer you get to your authenticity, the higher you can skyrocket. But this is scary, right? There's going from belonging closer to authenticity brings up a lot of fear. And, it requires letting your guard down and letting people in to see the real you. And I think this can be especially scary for people who, everyone else's secrets, but no one knows your secrets. Or you have this like rich inner world and you're afraid that if you like share it with people, they aren't going to get it, or you're just going to get like conflict, pushback, or disconnection because of it. And, you know, maybe you're just so used to being around like surface level connections that even though you crave deeper emotional connection, you don't know how to get there. And I think this belonging versus authenticity spectrum still applies to literally everything in our lives. It's like there's so much fear that comes up around just being vulnerable or, you know, letting people in. It's something that I've been personally grappling with, and really the inspiration behind this show. So let me just give you a little bit of context on like why this is so important to me. And, you know, fear of vulnerability has been the thing that's like my Achilles heel, because, you know, growing up, I was always, you know, expected to be stoic and strong and to not have anyone worry about me and for me to take care of everyone else. And, you know, it was largely because I was the eldest daughter. And it's like that Halloween costume where it's like the overachieving eldest daughter. It's like always an overachiever, hyper fixated on career success, always the therapist friend, you're always healing, you're a people pleaser, you have anxiety. Like that Halloween costume is me to a T, although I like to say I'm recovering in many of those areas. But when I think back to growing up, I was just, people only expected like the surface level version of me. And in a way, it was just like, do enough just to belong, like do enough to just confirm that the identity we want you to have is your identity. And so none of my interactions really required me to show up as my authentic self, or there wasn't space for that. And so as I've grown up, I've encountered just like certain friends who are like, absolutely not. You cannot come to me with this surface level shit. You know, we have to go deeper. And, you know, the first example of this that I have was from my mid-20s. I was working at that advertising agency in Chicago, the same one where I saw Sabrina Carpenter perform at the holiday party. And we were getting paid less than the CTA bus drivers, which if you don't know Chicago, the CTA bus drivers are the public transit bus drivers. So we were not getting paid a lot, but our social life was paid for. And, you know, every other day, it seems like we were going to events, going to sporting events, going to happy hours, going to dinners, going to fun activities around the city. So, you know, through that, we were constantly hanging out with coworkers, and that sort of environment just created a culture of just like peers hooking up with each other. And so I found myself in a situation where I was playing matchmaker for my friend who was a coworker. I was trying to set her up with this guy on my team. And I was kind of trying to do this all over Teams chat. And it became this all-encompassing project for me. Now, I know what you might be thinking, Allie, why was this an all-encompassing project for you? Why the fuck were you diving so deep into somebody else's life? And yes, fair. I was trying to distract myself from the double life that I was living, and it was a very uncomfortable position to be in, of living this double life. At the time, I was living on my friend's couch in Chicago because I was on my way out of the city. Like I was job searching to move out of Chicago and back to Indianapolis. And at the time, like remote work wasn't a thing at all. So I had to, I was like on my way out, but I had to pretend like I was still there and like rooted in this city. Only a couple people I worked with knew that I was even living on my friend's couch. And so, yeah, it was such a weird time of living a double life, and it felt very unstable because I didn't have my own space to go back to at the end of the day. So yeah, I was really trying to throw myself into somebody else's life and focus on their problems because I just couldn't cope with my own. And so there I was over the summer, that summer, and we were going to happy hours, and I would go, my friend and I, the gal and I would go to happy hours after work, probably like 2 or 3 times a week, just like chatting and hanging out, getting to know each other. I was of course trying to set her up with this guy on my team. And so we would be talking about that. We would be scheming about that. But over time, I would be asking her a lot of questions about her because, again, like I said, like I wanted to throw myself into her life and like really understand who she is. And I wanted to forget about everything in my own life. For the first maybe like 5 or 6 times we hung out, that was okay. Until one day, I remember we had just ordered our Prosecco's at the bar. We had our fries and ketchup come out. And so I was double fisting Prosecco and fries. And I remember taking a sip of my Prosecco and my friend turning to me and saying, "You know everything about me and I know nothing about you. So I'm going to start asking you questions until I feel like I know you." Now, my jaw was on the floor. I was like, "What? Me? No, you don't want to know about me." And I had no idea what to say to that other than just one word, okay. Because she was right. This whole time I had been wanting to be vulnerable. I had wanted to express my true self. I just didn't know how. And I think what felt super uncomfortable for me about this situation, or just like unknown territory that I had never been in before, was, I knew this person from work. Like literally the first day we met was me picking her up from an HR orientation because she was coming in to backfill my role because I was moving on to a new team. And so we met as I was picking her up from this HR orientation. And so in my brain, like as we started to hang out and go to these happy hours, which it would have been like a year after we had first met, but as we started to go to these happy hours, it was so difficult for me to disconnect the fact that we met in a professional setting, in like a hyper professional setting, in the sense that like you're the first person that I'm training. Like we met because I'm training you. And so it was super difficult for me to disconnect that in my head and be like, okay, it's safe for me to let you in because we're friends and we're no longer, like, our relationship is moving away from this whole like workplace setting. And now it's just like on a level of like, I want to know you. I want to know who you are. And so there I was. All I said was, okay. And from then on, she just started asking me questions about me. And with every question, it was like me taking one step forward, one step forward, one step forward, just slowly orienting myself to responding with the truth and giving honest answers. Because my gut reaction to a lot of these was to just give surface level answers. But I knew that that was not going to be acceptable for her. She, like, it was almost like it was like a buzzer of like, if I gave a too surface level of an answer, she'd be like, nope, try again. Energetically. Like, I don't think she ever quite said that, but me constantly taking one step forward, one step forward, one step forward, and reorienting myself to responding with the truth, that meant, really letting go of control over what her perception of me was. And it also, I had to step into just trusting that she could hold whatever I had to say. And as I started to share more and more about myself, she would constantly just be like, "Who are you?" And I never knew what to do with that, because I'm like, well, what do you mean? Like, this is me, this is my mind, this is my life. Like, why is this inspiring such a sense of awe? Like, I don't get it. And so over time, my nickname became Secret Garden. And so whenever like her friends from home would reach out and be like, "What are you doing after work?" She'd be like, "Oh, I'm going to happy hour with Secret Garden." And so this is the inspiration behind this podcast. When I think about that experience, I mean, again, that was really the first time where a friend said to me, "You need to show me who you are. Like, I will not accept anything less than the deepest version of you." And that was such a healing thing. It was probably one of the most loving things anyone's ever done for me. And, I've just been thinking about that moment a lot, because through that dynamic, I started to go from belonging to authenticity of just in what I was sharing and within the friendship. And so I think this whole spectrum of like belonging versus authenticity can be applied in every single category of our lives. So yes, I've really been looking at this spectrum of belonging versus authenticity in the context of relationship. And also I've been looking at it in the context of, what am I putting out in the world? And that brings me to just even like thinking about this podcast. I used to have an old podcast, and I started that, December of 2020. And then this new podcast I'm starting in January of 2025. So from then to now, I've been through my Saturn return. And, I won't go into too deep of details on that, because I'm going to do an episode specifically on my Saturn return. But throughout the process of my Saturn return, it just required me to shed so much skin, like shedding of old skin, shedding all the ways that weren't serving me anymore and the approaches that weren't serving me anymore. And, funny enough, like my first podcast was called The Company We Keep. And it was really kind of exploring why it's so important to be surrounded by good people, to be in good environments, to be, just like everything we surround ourselves with contributes to the kind of life we have. And so as we're trying to build our dream life, like we really have to look at the company we keep, because we have to make tweaks in that company in order to get us to the life that we desire. So that was my first podcast. And it's funny because I started that before my Saturn return, and then I went into my Saturn return. The lessons that I was being asked to learn during my Saturn return were directly related to the topics of my first podcast. So, and this is going to be different for everyone on like the lessons that you have to learn. And again, I will do an episode on this, but for me, the lessons that I had to learn were around my environment, around my living environment, around the people living in my environment, and around how I use my voice and communicate in my environment. And this was just such a painful time of just trying to learn those lessons. As I was like really in the mud and in the thick of like learning those lessons, I was shedding a lot of like old skin. And with that, like the old podcast just had to go. And, I think it's interesting because this new podcast is called Secret Garden, and it's about self-expression and moving towards your authentic self. How do you let your guard down? How do you let people in? And in that process, we're constantly facing like everyday dilemmas of, how do we let people in? And when I think about this in the context of astrology and what I'm, here on this planet to do, I think astrology can be a great way for us to kind of get clues and get guidance on like what we're here to do in this lifetime. But when I look at like my North Node in astrology, for example, like that's where I'm supposed to be moving towards in this lifetime. And my North Node is in Sagittarius in my first house. So that in and of itself is me needing to move towards and like really enhance my self-expression. It's letting go of all the extra shit that's been preventing me from truly expressing myself. And it's also like moving from surface level interactions to more deep, more soulful connection. And this is like precisely what this podcast is about. And it really aligns with my North Node. And, I think it's one of the most fascinating things about this for me is like the essence of both of these shows, like really the root of these shows is the same. Both are talking about overcoming obstacles and building this dream life. Like, how do you show up in your dream life? Like, what do you need to be to have your dream life? So the essence of the two shows are the same, but they're just packaged differently. And, I think about that first podcast and, while I loved it so much and truly it is an expression of me, there were certain things about it that didn't totally feel like me. So there I was talking in the first show about how, the company we keep is so important, but I wasn't necessarily, living that, because the company I was keeping was, the source of a lot of pain. And I needed to make changes in who I kept around me. And also like just from the podcast perspective, like I had guests on and I love all my guests. And I think all of those episodes were incredible. But when I really like sat and asked myself, like, why do I have guests? The answer was that I just feel like I'm trying to hide. And so I'm having guests on as a way for me to hide. And also I think we as women are told in many different ways that we exist to prop other people up. And that's what I really felt like I was doing. Like in a lot of ways, I felt worthy of creating a podcast and putting out a podcast because I knew that I would be propping other people up through it. But really, like, why I want to have a podcast is to share my voice and also allow other people to share their voice. Like, yes, guests matter and I want to have guests on, but I can't be doing it at the expense of my own voice. And I think that's been a really interesting lesson that I've had to learn and what I've had to identify within myself. So as I'm starting this new podcast, you're going to see a lot of solo episodes because I have shit to talk about. But there's also going to be guest episodes because I just love connecting with people and having these deep conversations. Like, and when I think about what really like sparks us to repackage ourselves, yes, it's like shit that we have to go through and we're kind of pushed to evolve based on the shit we go through in our lives. But I think we can also be so inspired by the people around us And I imagine that Sabrina Carpenter over the years has been surrounded by different people. She's had different muses, maybe different relationships, different collaborators, like different ideas coming in and out of her world that have allowed her to kind of find who she really is today. And, I've seen that in my own life. The kinds of people I'm surrounded by now are different from the people I was mostly surrounded by a few years ago. My friend who held my feet to the fire in that bar and was like, I'm going to ask you questions until I feel like I know you. She's become a really good friend, and she's still very much in my life, but not so much in my day-to-day life. Through these connections in my current day-to-day life, I've been thinking a lot about like, how do we go from surface level connection to deep emotional connection? And I feel like everyone in my life right now, in my current day-to-day life, is like helping me learn and helping me understand like how that actually happens. For example, the other day I was texting my friend and we were both sending fiery texts to each other, just both constantly firing off fiery texts. Neither of us were like taking a step back to really like receive what the other person was saying. We were just venting about the shit happening in our lives respectively. So both at the same time. And, I was only sharing like the most surface level version of the thing. Because again, like my default is to be surface level, because growing up, that was like the only thing that was ever expected of me. And so there I was like spitting fire, but only surface level fire. And my friend was doing the same thing too, until they took a step back and responded just like with really what the root of it all was. Like, what's the truth of the matter? Why all the fire and the rage? Like, what's underneath it? Which was the vulnerable approach. And as soon as they did that, I was like, whoa, let me do the same thing. And that was sort of an invitation for me to like share. And so I responded back with the truth of like, this is why I'm so frustrated. And as soon as we both shared our truths, all the fire and all the rage just kind of dissolved. And it was wild, because suddenly we both just had a deeper understanding of like, okay, what do we really care about here? And what's so painful? And why is all this rage coming up? And from that point on, we could then have this mutual understanding of where each other is at, and we can better support each other through the challenges because of it. And, I've had so many other interactions like that since then, and it's just been inspiring me so much. And this is what I want to talk about on this show. I'm just so grateful with the people I'm surrounded by, and they're constantly like giving me inspiration and pushing me to show up and share what's really on my mind, like what's on my heart, what's on my soul, like what am I wrestling with? And they do it in such a subtle way. It's like not weird at all. They're just like, it's just like taking one step forward every single day. And it's so natural. And I'm just so fascinated by these connections. Like, they're so nourishing. And I think to me, like, what I've been learning is like letting someone in, someone you trust, someone that has your back, is so nourishing and freeing. And it's what builds resilience in us and allows us to overcome any challenge we face. And I think as this world gets crazier and crazier by the day, no matter how chaotic it feels, we can always come back to this safe space of connection of Secret Garden to, show our true selves and to share our souls and allow someone else to know us. And, this is so important because this is the foundation of us being able to move through the world. It's the foundation for us to flourish in this world. And we deserve to make these connections as nourishing as possible, because the more nourishing they are, I think the better every single area of our life could get. But this makes me think about another really important point of we just have to trust the timing of our lives and trust that the people who come into our lives are here to get us to the next stage, or they're here to really teach us, like, what are we supposed to be learning in this exact moment? And through those teachings, that's how we get to the next level. So I think we really have to trust the timing. This is the beginning of a new year. We all have permission to package ourselves differently. And I think the best we could do is really, really get clear and ask ourselves, like, are we doing this because it feels authentic? Or are we doing this because it's meeting the expectations of someone else? And that's a big, big question to have to ask ourselves in every category of our lives. I'm certainly asking myself that in every category of my life. And we're going to do it together. Every single week, we're meeting here on Thursdays and we're talking about it. How can we continuously repackage ourselves? How can we get so close as possible, if not fully, into our authentic selves? That is what I'm focused on. And I know that's a messy process. So what we're going to be talking about are the everyday dilemmas that we go through and that we face when we're trying to let our guard down and become our authentic self. So thank you so much for being here. I'm so excited to go on this journey with you. You're safe here. This is a safe space, and let's talk about it. Let's figure out how to get ourselves to that next level.